On October 5th, 3 days after Mr. Stevens entered the hospital, he died from the complications he suffered from anthrax.
Unfortunately, we're here to report that Mr. Stevens passed away at 4 o'clock this afternoon.
When you talk about why someone dies of an anthrax infection, it can be lots of different reasons, but it's usually a result of this sort of what we call end organ failure.
Can you tell us what happened to his condition?
Essentially, he never recovered consciousness. He remained in respiratory failure, and earlier this morning developed renal failure, essentially what we call multi-system organ failure. He was placed on dialysis. He suffered a cardiac arrest and passed away.
There's a hole that's not, and it never will. It'll never be repaired, whatever happens from now on. But he was a wonderful person. People remember him. They remember his smile, the kindness, the gentleness, you know. He was just the perfect person for me.
There were two ways of looking at how Bob Stevens came down with anthrax. One was that he had been out in a rural area. Maybe there had been anthrax up in the mountains where he'd been hiking. The second explanation for Bob Stevens' infection was that he had contracted it at his workplace.
A sample of Mr. Stevens' spinal fluid was then sent to a microbiologist in an effort to try to determine what strain of anthrax might be involved.
A man named Paul Keim out at Northern Arizona State University, he worked through the night with his team, and they came up with AIM strain.
What that means is that this deadly material that killed this fellow came from a laboratory. And if it came from a laboratory, the chances were overwhelming that this was a bioterrorism event. The FBI deployed a team of investigators to the building where Stevens worked. And yes, spores were found in Bob Stevens' keyboard, which would probably explain his infection. But spores were also found in the mailroom.
If this was an act of bioterrorism, that meant that Robert Stevens simply didn't die of an anthrax infection. That meant this was an act of murder.
Robert Stevens' death goes from a medical mystery to a criminal investigation of bioterrorism. Authorities believe that an anthrax-laced letter was sent to Stevens' office at AMI. And in New York City, doctors are making a connection between the death of Stevens and the unusual symptoms Casey Chamberlain and Tom Brokaw's assistant, Erin O'Connor, are experiencing.
When Erin O'Connor reads about Bob Stevens, she says, they think there was a letter sent to the AMI people. What do we have? And so she begins to ask questions that maybe she herself was vulnerable. And she has had symptoms. She had a lesion on her neck. She had other symptoms that she was very worried about.
Tom's assistant had also been out pretty close to the time that I had been out. People started to sort of connect the dots. I noticed that I was having some spots on my legs. They look sort of like chickenpox scars. I probably had 10 of them.
The authorities now get involved because both of these women have such unusual symptoms.
People can get infected with anthrax in a few different ways. The most common way is if they come in exposure to their skin. That's called a cutaneous anthrax.
There were some tests done on Tom's assistant, and it was determined that she did indeed have cutaneous anthrax.
So this is a very dramatic moment. The physician who discovers this goes to the head of the CDC. The head of the CDC calls up Mayor Giuliani. Mayor Giuliani calls up Tom Brokaw. That's when he really gets on TV.
Tonight we find ourselves in the unusual and unhappy position of reporting on one of our beloved colleagues, a member of my personal staff who has contracted a cutaneous anthrax infection.
Casey is called in from her sickbed to go meet with one of Tom Brokaw's doctors. He's an infectious disease specialist, and he diagnoses her with cutaneous anthrax.
The only time that I was really worried about my own mortality was more so when I found out that what I had come in contact with was anthrax. I didn't know anything. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I was really sick, and I became more frightened once it was confirmed.
Residential mail was disrupted nationwide. The mailbox had become an instrument of death.
Saddam Hussein, Al-Qaeda, a domestic terrorist. Everything was on the table.
Welcome back to Something's Killing Me. I'm B.D. Wong. Photo editor Robert Stevens has died in a Florida hospital. And in New York City, Casey Chamberlain and Aaron O'Connor are suffering from symptoms of a deadly bacterial infection, all victims of a suspected act of bioterrorism from letters laced with anthrax.
I think it's important to remember here that when the letters go out to the media targets, they don't produce a reaction very quickly. So the perpetrator's waiting for the reaction to happen, nothing happens. So what does the perpetrator do? The perpetrator sends out 2 more letters to Senator Daschle and to Senator Leahy.
We get a call. They told us that a letter had been opened in Daschle's office with some kind of white powder that kind of poofed out of the envelope when it was opened. Because of the other scares that had gone on, there was a real fear that this might be anthrax.
First to Florida, then New York, and eventually here to Capitol Hill. Tests on an envelope mailed to Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle show it contained anthrax, highly potent anthrax.
When the letter addressed to Senator Daschle was opened at the Hart Senate Office Building on October 15th, it set off a great deal of intense concern in Washington, D.C. There was concern that a bioterrorism attack was underway.
The incident turned Senator Daschle's personal office into a crime scene. 40 staffers initially quarantined inside for several hours. Elsewhere on Capitol Hill, all mail deliveries were halted and mail already delivered returned to be examined for hazardous material.
When you get to the Daschle and Leahy letters, this is serious business. This is a kind of spore of such lightness, dispersibility, and lethality. It's aim strain again. You could really kill people. You could kill anybody who opened the envelope.
The Daschle letter was actually basically a weaponized anthrax with the additives to make it disperse highly. That meant that when that letter went through the postal system, it had a greater chance of dispersing and creating problems.
If you inhale it, it gets into your lungs. From your lungs, it goes into your lymph gland system in the middle of your chest. And from there, when the spore comes out and becomes active, it produces a toxin, which creates real bleeding damage in the middle of your chest, and it can start to cause total organ failure.
So the first thing we did is focused on the people that we thought were exposed or may have been exposed in Senator Daschle's office. But we also needed to think about where that letter came from. And could people have been exposed in that path as well?
The fear and panic that accompanied this anthrax incident was overwhelming. There was fantasies about the vents, that getting in the air, that if you're just on Capitol Hill, you might inhale it.
We actually did a lot of sampling, taking swabs on surfaces, in air vents, understanding how air traveled through air vents. People were scared. It was a scary time.
More disturbing discoveries in the nation's capital. Anthrax inside the Supreme Court and the State Department.
The largest Senate office was closed for decontamination, and the House of Representatives was shut down. Mail delivery was stopped at the White House and the Supreme Court.
Residential mail was disrupted nationwide. I mean, the mailbox had become an instrument of death.
Everyone was worried about touching something as simple as going to the mailbox and opening your mail. People were worrying, should I be taking an antibiotic too, just in case?
We had a public who was very concerned. There were people who didn't really understand what being exposed meant or not.
People just lined up outside of our clinic to get tested, and in each case, we started them with a short course of antibiotic, in this case, ciprofloxacin, just in case they were positive.
People took these preventive antibiotics, and I'm certain that it saved people's lives. The investigation that's happening in the Capitol is focusing not only on how that letter got into the office, but also who possibly could have come in contact with the letter. And that investigation then led another, very big path down to the postal system.
Any mail addressed to the U.S. Capitol originates from a central Washington, D.C. post office, Brentwood. D.C. officials say a man who works there is in the hospital.
In the Brentwood facility, there was a lot of testing that happened, and we were finding anthrax spores. I don't think people really thought that spores could be released out of a sealed envelope as they were being processed in a postal facility.
Unfortunately for workers at the facility in Washington, D.C., some of that material sprayed out of the envelope and infected and killed 2 postal workers, Joe Kersine and Tommy Morris.
We would brief the White House and HHS every day on what was going on. And anytime he was approached about support, the president always reassured us and just said, whatever you want, you got.
We've got teams on the ground, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, the FBI, working closely with local agencies to respond quickly. Our nation is still in danger.
People were scared. And the assumption many people made right away was these anthrax attacks are related to the attacks in this country on September 11, 2001.
All of the letters contained the language, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great, clearly raising the specter that perhaps an international terrorist organization was behind the mailings.
There's no question that anybody who would mail anthrax with the attempt to harm American citizens is a terrorist. And there's no question that Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization, so it wouldn't put it past me that they're, it wouldn't surprise me that they're involved with it.
There was a lot of speculation about who could be to blame. Saddam Hussein, Al-Qaeda, domestic terrorism. Everything was on the table.
The foreign source persisted, I think, in the wake of 9/11 because it was too horrible to think of the fact that maybe this was an insider. It's demonic, actually, to think of the mind that would perpetrate such a crime. There's a real cruelty here.